Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event on doing business in Africa, addressing the corruption factor. My name is Manda Miyango, and I'm the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program. I know that we have a number of people following our webcast and on Twitter, and we welcome you as well. To those on Twitter, you can follow the live tweets of today's event on the Africa program's Twitter account, Africa Up Close, and can contribute to the conversation using the hashtag corruption. As some of you know, this event is the second in a series of the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, which was launched in September. And this is a 5-year project offering forward-leaning programming and research that addresses key economic, business, and development issues in Africa and in US-Africa relations. Through an annual series of 3 major events, the Africa Forum series provides practical policy options for fostering mutually beneficial economic relations between the United States and Africa, and for strengthening inclusive and sustainable development in Africa. All of you are here because you know that economic and development issues are critical, and for far too long, in terms of US engagement with Africa, they have taken a back seat as humanitarian crisis and conflict and other issues have stolen the spotlight. In this regard, I really wish to thank Brown Capital Management leadership, especially Mr. Eddie and Mrs. Sylvia Brown, for their vision and for their generous support in allowing the Africa program to work on an issue that could make a difference in terms of millions of lives on the African continent, could make a difference in terms of reshaping US-Africa engagement. So Mr. and Mrs. Brown, thank you so much. When we launched the Africa Forum in September, we started by looking at the state and future of US-Africa economic relations 1 year after the historic US-Africa Leaders Summit. We build on that discussion today by looking at the nature, scale, and scope of corruption in Africa and its impact on companies wishing to do business on the continent. And we wanted to focus on this because even as the Obama administration positions US-Africa economic engagement, we know that a major concern for American companies has to do with this perception of the toll that corruption takes on the African continent, on the fear of being mired in corruption-related issues, even as they seek to engage economically in Africa. And it's important for us to have this discussion because, as many of you know, Africa was the fastest growing region in the world for foreign direct investment last year. But in total terms, the continent's share of FDI remains small. So although you have this picture of Africa as this big blob of that's mired in corruption, the true picture, though, is a whole lot more complex and a whole lot more nuanced. And so we're going to be talking about some of those issues today, really unpack this picture of corruption on the continent. What does it look like? How does it manifest itself? What is the scope and scale? And how has the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act impacted US businesses seeking to invest in Africa? And how can US companies handle the issue of corruption while remaining competitive and staying within the parameters of strict US anti-corruption laws? We also want to take a look at the key measures that have been taken by African countries that have been most successful in combating corruption, and there are some, and what we can learn from those successes. We also want to push the agenda by looking at the additional measures that African governments can put in place to address the problem, and also what the US government and the private sector can do to help address the challenge of corruption and improve the landscape for investment and growth in Africa. So to help address these questions, we have brought together 3 experts from Africa and the United States. And they bring different sectoral perspectives to this discussion. And I'll introduce our speakers now, and we'll do so in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker will be Mr. Chistiaan Poortman, and who will look at the big picture of corruption in Africa. What does corruption look like across Africa? He is a senior advisor at Transparency International, as well as chair of the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative and a board member of Transparency USA. He has many years of experience of anti-corruption work through his time with Transparency International, and as a senior advisor and director of global programs, as well as members of the Transparency International USA, a national chapter for the United States. He is active in the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative, the steering group of the Open Contracting Partnership, and other initiatives that promote transparency. Before joining Transparency International, he was with the World Bank, where he held a number of positions, including Regional Vice President for the Middle East and North Africa, as well as several other positions focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa. Given his background, we have asked him to address the scale and scope of corruption in Africa, its key forms and manifestations, as well as the impact, particularly in the business sector. We've also asked him to identify the most impacted countries on the continent from his perspective. And finally, we've asked him to offer 3 best practices and lessons learned for addressing corruption, as well as his top recommendation for African governments, for the US and for US businesses respectively, as they try to address corruption on the continent. Mr. Poortman, welcome.
Thank you.
Our second speaker will be Mr. Jan Dunin-Wasowicz. Wasowicz, thank you.
Thank you.
We have asked him to look at some of the key risks faced by US companies seeking to do business in Africa, particularly as they relate to corruption. He is an associate at Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigations Practices of Hugh, Hubbard and Reed. He has experience designing anti-corruption policies and programs, performing compliance audits, internal investigations, and due diligence reviews on third-party agendas and joint venture business partners around the world, including in connection with the US Department of Justice and the US Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as World Bank inquiries. He has worked on international commercial and investment treaty arbitrations, including serving as assistant to the chair of an International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes arbitral tribunal. Given his experience with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and performing due diligence related to Africa, we've asked him to address the risks of US companies face in doing business in Africa. We've also asked him to address the impact of the FCPA, if any, and how other countries compare with the US regarding its policies related to corruption. We have also asked him to provide his top 3 recommendations for the US government to enhance the fight against corruption while seeking to encourage US competitiveness in Africa, as well as his top 2 recommendations for African countries wishing to attract more US business engagement. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
While the overwhelming perception is that Africa is one big corrupt continent, as I said earlier, the real picture is much more complex. In fact, there are some countries that have a strong record of fighting corruption. For instance, Transparency International ranks the United States as 17th on its corruption index, and there are 4 African countries in the top 50. Botswana at 31, Cape Verde at 42, the Seychelles at 43, and Mauritius ranked 47. In addition, the Mo Ibrahim Index on African Governance ranks Mauritius at number 2 after Botswana for accountability, which includes fighting against corruption. Given Mauritius's ranking, we have also invited Ambassador Sooroojdev Phokeer, the Mauritian ambassador to the United States, to join us here today. Ambassador Phokeer is a barrister at law, and he is, as I mentioned earlier, Mauritius's ambassador to the United States, a position that he has held since July 2015. Prior to that, he was Mauritius's ambassador to the Arab Republic of Egypt from 2001 to 2004, and also designated as Mauritius' permanent representative to the African Union in 2011. He is a campaign manager and party strategist for the ruling Socialist Party, as well as a member of the Politburo of the Mauritius ruling party. From 1991 to 1995, Ambassador Phokeer was a member of the Legislative Assembly, and from 93 to 95, the Parliamentary Private Secretary in the Prime Minister's Office. He was also the Special Advisor on Agro-Industry in the Prime Minister's Office from 2005. Given the ranking of his country, we've asked the ambassador to discuss the main measures that Mauritius has taken to minimize corruption, the lessons learned that he can draw from Mauritius' experience that would be useful to other countries and the private sector. And also, we've asked him to offer recommendations on how international partners could best assist African countries in the fight against corruption on the continent. Ambassador Phokeer, welcome. We've asked each of our speakers to offer remarks for 8 minutes. And after all 3 speakers have made their remarks, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. With that, I'll turn it over to our first panelist. Mr. Poortman, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and
Transparency International to contribute to your event here today. As you indicated in your opening remarks, my presentation will briefly deal with the scale and the scope of corruption in, we call it Africa, but what we really mean here is sub-Saharan Africa, at least for the purposes of my presentation. I will then deal with some of the manifestations and the impact, then with some of the lessons learned, and eventually a number of recommendations, my top recommendations, as you mentioned them, and then a word more specifically about the role of the private sector. So what is important when we start is to say what we mean by corruption, and this is not going to be long. I think it's important, at least for the presentation that I give and for the work that Transparency International does. It's the definition we use is the abuse of public office for private economic gain. And it focuses uniquely on corrupt practices involving public officials. It therefore excludes corrupt practices that are exclusively existing among private sector agents. So talking about the scale, our chair already quoted some numbers related to the Corruption Perceptions Index. This is an index that, as you know, is one of the trademarks of Transparency International. It's been published for over 20 years. And it lists corruptions from the least corruption in African countries or worldwide countries, but in this case Africa, from the least corrupt to the most corrupt on a scale from 1 to 100. And as I said, it measures perceptions of corruption. The majority of African countries have indeed a score of less than 50. And that transparency usually calls countries at that level that corruption is being seen as endemic or systemic. There are indeed a number of countries that score higher than 50. Botswana has been mentioned. You mentioned Cape Verde, Seychelles, Mauritius. But what is important to underline is that there has been really very little movement over the years. There has been a few changes here and there, but the pattern and the distribution has remained more or less the same, at least over the last 5 to 7, 10 years. But it's also important to realize that if you look at the totality of the index, that nearly 2/3 of the 175 countries that are listed in the survey score less than 50. So in that sense, it is not much different from what we find in the rest of the world. The other survey I wanted to quote is one that is actually being launched today, which is called People and Corruption, Africa Survey 2015, a survey of about 40,000 respondents in 28 sub-Saharan African countries to provide a little bit more of a human face on the issue of corruption. The findings are not that much more encouraging. I urge you to go to the TDI website and see the results of the survey for yourself. The majority of the respondents, about 2/3 of them, say that corruption has actually increased over the last 12 months. The most highly corrupt institutions in the order were police, business executive, and government officials. And it's also important finding is that poor people who use public services are twice as likely as rich people to have to pay a bribe. And very alarmingly, reporting on corruption and corruption reporting mechanisms are often seen as too dangerous. And if there is a corruption reported, it's usually ineffective. So in other words, not a very uplifting picture. There are a couple of bright spots, however. Botswana, Burkina Faso, Lesotho, Senegal were all seen by the respondents as making reasonable progress across the board. Mainly in response to a question, is my government, your government, doing well or badly in fighting corruption? And this actually shows some interesting progress in a number of limited countries. But the sad reality obviously is that Africa, that had been scoring relatively high overall growth rates over the last 10 years, definitely in comparison to other parts of the world, has seen little of that translate into opportunities for the poor and the disadvantaged. And whereas there are no direct causality that can be demonstrated, everybody seems to agree that widespread corruption is one of the critical factors that are inhibiting the fruits of that growth to be distributed more broadly. Keep in mind that 80% of sub-Saharan population still continues to live on $2, less than $2 a day. And more fundamentally, that corruption has and continues to severely damage the social and the institutional fabric of many countries. A word about manifestations. The major form of corruption, as you are well aware of, is really this, what we call state capture. It's frequently at the core of any African state, of many African states, and the state is controlled by elites, primarily through their capacity to extort rents as a result of their proximity or control of the state apparatus, and very importantly thereby influencing the mobilization and the allocation of public resources. In particular, it's manifested in a number of areas, siphoning off of budget revenues, particularly in the mineral and the oil and gas income, providing unjustified tax exemptions. Very importantly, corrupt procurement practices, which is a major area of concern and an area that is being addressed by institutions like Transparency International in providing help in this area. Provision of social services, health and education, water supply, education, cash transfer programs. Infrastructure, which is an issue is close to my heart as I work for the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative, to which I can come back in a minute. And bureaucratic red tape, which is well known to all. The impact has been, I would say, fourfold, fivefold. More broadly, an undermining of the rule of law and a weakening of institutions and institutional foundations on which development so very much depends. A distorted or an inefficient or a suboptimal allocation of public resources that has resulted in cases of waste and losses. Very importantly and very difficult to address, it has been eroding the trust in the government and its policies, affecting inter alia the business environment and the risks associated with doing business. And there has been a drying up of international investment. Many investors see Africa as too risky, with very little predictability, and an area which is not usually the focus of foreign direct investment, except for a number of areas and sectors that we can talk about more. Overall, what this has led to is a very significant outflow of illicit funds from the African continent. Some of the resource-rich sub-Saharan African countries, major illicit financial flows that in some cases, the ECA, for instance, has an estimate just about the trade transfer mispricing funds related to that, and that already, according to their estimate, is $60 billion a year. Mm-hmm. So if you add the others to it, we're talking about a sum of money that is significantly in excess of any aid or any other support that is being provided to the continent. So the lesson that we've learned is that the track record of fighting corruption in Africa is obviously mixed, if not somewhat disappointing. The basic model for fighting corruption, as it was put together in the 1990s, was very much supported by external agents, obviously bilateral donors, World Bank, organizations like Transparency International and many others. And the reforms had some impact. There were some key elements to these reforms. Many of them were focused on the leadership and the higher echelons, the power in government, to see whether they could change the policies. There was an emphasis on the establishment of dedicated anti-corruption agencies, sort of stepping into that void between the judiciary and the law enforcement agencies. New rules and codes of conduct for policymakers. There were a number of changes and reforms that were being implemented. The unfortunate result has been that whereas there has been progress, there has been overall a lack of willingness or a lack of capacity on the part of the governments to monitor and to ensure compliance. The political will has frequently been absent, and the emphasis that should have been put on bringing more bottom-up accountability was never really much implemented, and impunity became a very important issue, and it still is. So, recommendations, and I've picked 2 or 3, and I'm sure there are many others that one can pick. But I think the debate and the experience over the last 20 years has thrown up some important directions of thinking and further action. There is a basic need for creating transparency and openness in government public resource management. As they say, sunlight is the best antiseptic. Countries where citizens are able to scrutinize government activities and debate the merits of various public policies do make a difference in enhancing accountability and fighting corruption. We've seen that in a number of cases. And in this respect, obviously, press freedom, literacy, and more particularly, whether the civil society can play its role and has an important voice in this is very important. Unfortunately, however, the space, as we call it, for civil society in many countries, and I'm not just talking about Africa, but also particularly in Africa, has been reduced over time. And this is a major issue that we also face on a day-to-day basis in the work of Transparency International. So greater transparency and openness. Secondly, cutting red tape and reducing the opportunities for corruption and extortion. Excessive regulations, bureaucratic procedures, limiting direct contact between government officials will reduce opportunities for illicit transactions. And what is important here is that new smart technologies make this a more reality. Using those technologies, reducing that interaction between government officials and citizens, for instance, in the areas of tax collection, application for permits and licenses, and very importantly, procurement, has shown to have a dramatic positive impact on fighting corruption. The other is what I call focusing on the supply side and a more balanced approach in fighting corruption. In other words, the bribe giver is as important as the bribe taker. And we found that, particularly in Africa, the bribe giver in many instances is external. It is from the outside that bribes are being offered to establish a presence in the country's markets in competition with local and often other external competitors. Corruption has clearly become much more of a cross-border phenomenon than it was before. What that means is that more emphasis will continue to be placed and will be placed on the international legal framework for corruption control, which is is equally important as the individual country's legal framework. And there are a number of them, and I'm sure we're going to discuss them more this afternoon. I mean, one of them is the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, obviously the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act, and very importantly, the UN Convention Against Corruption, which is the global framework with over 140 signatory countries and a broad range of subjects that is being covered. Domestic and foreign corruption, extortion, preventive measures, money laundering provisions, conflict of interest, recovery of stolen assets. It's a very comprehensive mechanism. And what is also very important is that it has, after a lot of battle, a very clear monitoring system, which is currently being implemented and which allow for promises and commitments to be translated into action, or at least be continuously assessed. As far as Africa is concerned, finishing up here, there are a number of African-specific anti-corruption conventions. There's the African Union one, there's the SADC protocol, there's the ECOWAS protocol, all of them driving in the same direction, but many of them missing a robust monitoring mechanism. And this is an area where I think a lot of progress can be made also under the African peer review system of the African Union. A final word about the private sector. You will allow me to say that the private sector has been, in many instances and over a long time, a spectator in the anti-corruption reform, despite obviously the importance as a supplier of what I would call a supplier of corruption in Africa. And the majority of the private sector have viewed and are still viewing to some extent corruption as a tax that is predictable, and as long as it's stable, that they have no problem in working with and around it. And clearly this is also reflected in the various surveys that have been conducted. There has been a change, however. First, the international framework that I just talked about has become much more strict for foreign investors globally into Africa. There's an increasingly effectiveness in preventing international corruption, and UNCAC will bring even greater pressure. There is the issue of enhanced monitoring, as I said, that will make it more effective. And secondly, as we know, the effective penalties and sanctions are very considerable. And we know all the cases of companies that have been fined under these laws. And it has had, I think, a strong beneficial effect on the way large international investors and companies behave. Secondly, we see that corruption has become a major item on the international agenda, G20, G7, and this is related to a number of issues, but more particularly because of the concern about the global illicit flows that are going around and their links with international crime and global terrorism, and that will be a strong factor in the international community coming to grips with the issue of corruption. Finally, I think there is a growing realization on the part of private industry that an environment of transparency and accountability does provide major benefits to investors in terms of a level playing field, honest and fair competition, a predictable business environment, providing trust and confidence, and a reduction of commercial risks. Many of the more enlightened companies, I would say, do feel that fighting corruption is good for business, and that perhaps is the most important incentive that we can look forward to in bringing the private sector into this global fight against corruption. And the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative that I chair is a good example of that, and I can say more about that later if there's an interest. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Jan, you can do it from there or you can do it from up here.
All right.
All right.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Myongwa, for the invitation to participate in today's program. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and my remarks will in large part draw from an article that a colleague, Brian Silliman, and I recently wrote for the Africa Law Committee of the ABA section of International Law. A seasoned traveler once wrote that the continent is too large to describe. It is a veritable ocean, a separate planet, a varied, immensely rich cosmos. Only with the greatest simplification, for the sake of convenience, can we say Africa. And although in recent years, many foreign investors have felt an alluring sense of opportunity when considering the continent as a whole, reviewing the corruption risks that they face in different African countries requires the same caution against generalization. And so with that in mind, I've organized my remarks around three themes. First, the corruption risks that foreign companies are facing in Africa. Next, the drivers of anti-corruption reforms and their limits from a business perspective. And three, some thoughts on what could be done moving forward. And turning to the main sources of risk, I believe it's important to keep in mind that corruption risks can surface at all stages of an investment in Africa. whether it is in connection with developing business opportunities, setting up vehicles or joint ventures, managing assets, dealing with creditors, or handling a dispute arising out of an investment. But foreign investors face even more significant risks when they engage third parties to act on their behalf or partner up with local companies. Investors are sometimes caught off guard and find themselves in difficult or improper situations. And because in Africa it is fundamental to know who you're doing business with, thorough due diligence on partners and third parties, such as agents and consultants, is therefore absolutely critical. Foreign investors should take those risks very seriously because they may face criminal or civil prosecution in a variety of jurisdictions, starting at home. The United States and all OECD countries, in principle, hold their companies and citizens accountable for their conduct in Africa. The FCPA and possibly increasingly the UK Bribery Act provide what some call the backbone of supply-side enforcement of anti-corruption norms of conduct occurring in Africa. Now, these instruments have broad and extensive jurisdictional reach. The FCPA, for instance, can apply to American companies investing directly in Africa or to non-American companies that are subject to the FCPA and are carrying out business activities in Africa. FCPA enforcement particularly has expanded exponentially in the last decade, and companies with operations in Africa have been significantly affected. Investors can also face prosecution locally. And I'd like to point out that Africa has developed a rich body of anti-corruption norms coming from a variety of instruments at the UN level, the regional level, or the sub-regional level. However, African jurisdictions have approached the problem of corruption in international business with varying degrees of intensity and success. So we have the supply side, the local enforcement, and lastly we have the multilateral development banks, which can influence financing costs and business opportunities. And companies have a lot to lose from fraud and corruption. These institutions, which play a key role in many projects in Africa, have defined and enforce rules of conduct for entities that participate in their programs. The World Bank, for instance, can impose administrative sanctions, and since 2010, 5 multilateral development banks, including the African development banks, are bound by a cross-debarment agreement, which is suggesting a form of convergence or at least joint efforts. Now, within this regulatory framework, supply-side norms, local laws, and development agencies, I think it's important for investors to be mindful that actions that are taken in one jurisdiction may have consequences in other seemingly less implicated jurisdictions. In this context, it's important to highlight that anti-corruption efforts are ongoing, and I've identified a number of actors. First, foreign investors that take anti-corruption compliance seriously. They're often put in difficult situations, but they have the support, the resolve, and the resources to abide by the standards. And their actions, in turn, influence local partners and business communities. Next, we have governments that engage the issue heads-on and that have already factored into their policy priorities that they have a lot to gain by taking a firm stance against corruption. We're also seeing increasing cooperation between enforcement authorities, which is done either informally through meetings and ad hoc exchanges, or more formally by developing new mutual legal assistance agreements. And again, also in the background, we have the recognition at the G20 that corruption is a global scourge that should be dealt globally. Fundamental problems persist, however, and I've identified the following. I think perhaps one of the most significant problems is the uneven anti-corruption enforcement amongst capital exporting jurisdictions. Regardless of how African authorities may choose to respond to improper conduct in a given case, not all investors face the same risks back at home. While many jurisdictions in Africa have comprehensive anti-corruption laws on their books, local enforcement is often simply lacking. And the perception of corruption may be part of broader concerns regarding the standard of investment protection. Finally, if most countries are no longer frontier markets, many jurisdictions still suffer from weak institutions, resulting in a lack of continuity in anti-corruption policy and implementation. In many jurisdictions, citizens' initiatives and new forms of integrity advocacy receive too little recognition. And this brings me to the third theme of my presentation, possible recommendations. And I've identified three sets. Dr. Myongwa, I've taken the liberty to address a recommendation to regional organizations.
All right.
Traditional capital exporting jurisdictions should continue to prosecute improper conduct and allocate additional resources to fighting economic offenses and crimes related to corruption. The United States and Europe particularly can do more to neutralize the proceeds of corruption that may have occurred in Africa. Capital exporting jurisdictions should also make fighting corruption a trade issue when negotiating agreements with African countries. Concerning regional organizations in Africa, I believe that the fight against corruption needs independence and continuity. And although it is obviously not possible to force countries to take action, it is possible to remind them periodically of their performance. And in this context, I believe the African Union has a role to play. And although monitoring systems already exist, I think they should be enhanced. And the Union could consider developing a monitoring and assessment system inspired by the OECD Anti-Corruption Working Group, for instance, to institutionalize the policy review and implementation process. Finally, African governments should enforce their anti-corruption laws and improve transparency and accountability in public administrations. They should not hesitate to rely on NGOs that support citizens' initiatives. In this context, they should not be afraid to adopt tailored solutions and innovate. And to address the problem of perception, they should communicate about these initiatives. To conclude, taken together, I believe these issues would, one, reduce the occurrence of actual corruption, particularly in the public sector, two, lead to more enforcement actions and bridge the enforcement gap, three, address the problem of corruption, and four, create more favorable conditions for investment, thus resulting in a win-win situation for investors and states in Africa. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Ambassador Phokeer, tell us what Mauritius is doing.
Yeah, doing well.
Please.
Thank you for inviting me to this forum. And I also thank the assistants. In spite of the rainy weather, you're here. I've been asked to speak about the case of Mauritius, how we've been able to succeed to some extent. Let me be modest as a diplomat. And also, as a diplomat, I will not have the opportunity of being as severe, frank, and direct as the two previous orators. But I will just give you a few facts of how Mauritius succeeded to some extent to combat fraud and corruption. In fact, it is the whole philosophy of government, the political will and commitment to this cause. Mauritius, being a small island, we believe that our commitment to international organization is very important. Hence, our commitment to the United Nations Commission or Convention on Anti-Corruption. From there we started, and we thought that in order to achieve that, our objective, we have to amend our laws. We started amending our laws, but within democratic rule. And we started legislating to criminalize certain offenses. There were gaps in our legislation. And also to legislate to incorporate domestic requirements, to legislate to incorporate regional, international conventions into our laws, so that whatever we agree abroad, we bring it to domestic legislation so that we can investigate, prosecute. But before that, we have to criminalize it, bring it in our law as an offense. And we continued, we pursued that way, trying to harmonize domestic laws with whatever agreements we have had outside the country. So let me give a few dates. 1984 saw the coming of the Anti-Corruption Tribunal Act. But that was not working well. Therefore, in 1999, the Economic Crime Office replaced the Anti-Corruption Tribunal Act. Before that, in the 90s, 1991, that was the year where I was elected, and I had the opportunity of voting for the Declaration of Assets Act, where for the first time in the history of Mauritius, elected representatives of the country had to declare their assets. We moved on. In 2001, we brought in New Companies Act. We introduced the New Companies Act, where we brought amendments to modernize our companies in Mauritius. And in 2002, we introduced the Prevention of Corruption Act, POCA, wherefrom we created an independent commission against corruption, and also we introduced the Financial Intelligence and Anti-Money Laundering Act, FIAMLA. In 2003, government adopted the Mutual Assistance in Criminal-Related Matters, and the Banking Act of 2004, the Bank of Mauritius Act of 2004 were amended in 2008. Public Procurement Act was brought in. Financial Services Act followed. In 2012, Asset Recovery Act was amended to allow for seizure. And now we are undergoing some changes in the Constitution. Shortly, we will have a good governance and integrity reporting bill. And for that to be able to give effect, we have to amend the Constitution. So we're introducing the Constitution Amendment Bill. And from there, we will create the Financial Crime Commission, which will be an apex body under which you will have the Financial Intelligence Unit, the Financial Services Commission, and the Asset Recovery Department. There will be a new Declaration of Assets Act, and we are introducing Financing of Political Parties Act. Government of Mauritius has thought it wise to introduce all these legislations in order to combat fraud, corruption, and to bring more transparency. Good governance is high in the agenda of Mauritius. Therefore, we have developed anti-corruption tools. I've got a shopping list, but I will state a few. Public sector anti-corruption framework. anti-corruption committees, private sector anti-corruption task force, public-private platform against corruption, and handbooks, guidelines, manuals on best practices. I'll not go in details, not to get you bored. And we have received assistance for that from the Commonwealth Secretariat and technical assistance of U.S. Department of Treasury, Office of Technical Assistance of U.S. Department of Treasury. We have introduced, created institutional frameworks. Mauritius has signed and ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, member of Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Network, African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. Mauritius is compliant with AU-NEPAD peer review mechanism, member of the International Association of Anti-Corruption Authorities, member of the Association of Anti-Corruption Agencies of Commonwealth, and so on. At a regional level, Mauritius has subscribed to SADC Protocol Against Corruption and the SADC Anti-Corruption Committee. Mauritius is an active member of Southern African Forum Against Corruption, SAFAC, in the SADC region. At a national level, government has created Ministry of Financial Services, Good Governance and Institutional Reforms. That was for the first time in the history of Mauritius in 2014. And has consolidated the following complementary institutions: Financial Intelligence Unit, Asset Forfeit Office, National Committee on Money Laundering, Central Procurement Board, Financial Reporting Council, Financial Services Commission, Office of Public Sector Governance, Equal Opportunities Commission. At an international level, Mauritius is party to the Mauritius Convention of Transparency, March 2015. This deals with cases before 14 should be dealt on the basis of UN Citral rules of arbitration. We have signed investment promotion and protection agreements, IPPAs, with 39 countries, and we have developed links with anti-corruption agencies in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Madagascar, India, and United Kingdom. Mauritius is moving forward with the fight for anti-corruption against corruption high on the agenda. And for that, we have developed a three-pronged approach: inclusive, multi-stakeholder, so that all layers of society participate in that initiative. We have opened our stock market to investors. We have abolished foreign exchange control. The Constitution of Mauritius guarantees no expropriation. We are hosting an international center for arbitration, probably next year. And we have intergovernmental agreement with US for tax information exchange agreement, TIEA, in order to implement FATCA. We are high on the agenda with respect to good governance, free economy, ease to do business, FDI per capita, and we are constantly reviewed by OECD and World Trade Organization. So all these things have contributed to increase investment, trade between Mauritius and many countries. And standing here, I'm proud to say that trade between Mauritius and US is growing. Investment opportunities big, US and Mauritius. And right now, 200 companies have already invested in Mauritius. That is some good news I'm bringing to Washington. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you. All right, so 3 very different perspectives from our speakers, I think covering a broad range of issues, not just the challenges, but also offering some possible options and entry points for beginning to make headway on this challenge. So let me now open it up to discussion. And what I'll do is I'll take 3 questions at a time. So if you want to make an intervention, please raise your hand, and once you've been acknowledged, we'll get a mic to you. Identify yourself, the institutions with which you are affiliated, if any, and the speaker to whom you're addressing your question. And you have 1 minute to make your intervention. So I will start with the gentleman in the back over there, and then I'll swing back there and bring it up front. So, sir.
Yes, Richard America, Georgetown University School of Business. I'm on the board of trustees of the West African Society for Business Ethics. Mm-hmm. It's based at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and the intention is to create business ethics programs in every country in ECOWAS. Business ethics teaching at every level, undergrad, MBA, middle and senior executive, public sector, private sector, we believe can have beneficial results in helping to develop a modern management code of ethics that operates on a daily basis. And we're looking for corporate and foundation and other partners who want to join with us to make this succeed.
Thank you. So not so much a question, but a comment on some things that could be done. So thank you, sir. I'll take the lady in the back over there. Let's mix it up.
Okay. I'll stand, I'm sure. All right, my name is Edwina, and I'm with Partners Global. And we focus on working with communities, businesses, and governments in building inclusive and democratic institutions, and also fighting corruption and working to create sustainable peace. My question focuses on, and it's directed to Mr. Poortman and Mr. Dunin. I'm sorry. And this is a high-level conversation between governments and businesses. However, I want to know, what are your thoughts, and how do you see space for civil societies and local communities to be engaged in the multi-stakeholder types of conversations at fighting corruption?
Okay, we'll take one more. So a question on the role of citizens and civil society and serving as watchdogs and perhaps more in the fight against corruption. We'll take the gentleman right in front of you there.
Sorry. Good afternoon. I'm Joya Tikum. I'm actually with the UNDP in Ethiopia. I perhaps wanted to highlight a little bit what I think is missing from the conversation. You know, what I didn't hear clearly is a delineation between corruption, but also illicit financial flow, which you talked about. There seems to be a confusion between the two. There seems to be messaging that you can use the same strategy to fight both. I think in Africa we've seen that hasn't worked for the past 30 years. While we are now talking more and more about the impact of illicit financial flow, corruption has always existed. The mistake we are making now is the strategy we are trying to use. We're trying to use the same strategy we used and failed in fighting corruption to fight illicit financial flow. So I would love to hear more from the panel. But to my colleague from Transparency International.
Hey, my brother, you're sneaking in too. Give me one.
Sorry, I came from Ethiopia. Just leave me say the last thing before I leave.
Seriously.
Yeah, I was going to say the laws has never been the problem in Africa. We have a litany of laws and regulation. What we have failed to recognize in Africa is the role of the civil society and innovation and ICT. The Botswana, Mauritius, and all the countries you've mentioned, they've succeeded because they embrace innovation and ICT to neutralize, the red tapes. So I was wondering how you see innovation and ICT helping, the fight against corruption going forward. And I'm sorry if I have to leave now.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right, so that was 3, and I think what I'll do is I'll just go down this way. Shall I start with you, Christian?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Yeah.
So pick 1 or 2.
I think the one about civil society space is very close to my heart, and obviously that's somewhat connected also to the role of ICT and what have you. I mean, there is no question. I mean, what I said in my presentation is that the greater transparency and openness is one that will allow all stakeholders, but particularly civil society, to play the role that it's supposed to play in providing an opportunity to be aware, to understand, to ask questions, and to criticize. And clearly, my organization, Transparency International, lives by that. There is no other way that it could fulfill its role. So I'm obviously a very strong proponent on that. What I did mention in my presentation is that the space for civil society to do this is unfortunately being eroded. I don't have the details here with me, but there have been, and not just in Africa, but there has been a slew of countries that have in various ways tried to limit the importance and the voice of civil society. And that is of deep concern, I think, to many, to my organization, but I think to many other organizations, and to the broader quest for transparency and accountability. Having said that, and I don't want to move away from it, it is very important, and it needs to be addressed, and I think it's an issue that continuously gets put under the rug. But to the extent there is room for civil society, clearly there are a lot of other things that need to happen, and many of you know this. I mean, for civil society to be able to play that role, they need to have the capacity, they need to have the training, they need to have the room to do this, and it needs to be, the information need to be made available to them in a format that is understandable and most relevant to the particular issues that they're concerned about. So there are a whole slew of things that fall with that, and my organization and many others, some of them I'm sure represented in this room, are all very keen to make that happen and to allow civil society to play that role. Now, I can go into the others, but maybe the others want to answer the question about the illicit flows or others.
Sure.
I can come back to that.
We can come back to it.
Well, thank you. First, I'll maybe touch upon the same issue. I think that it goes hand in hand. I think in the fight against corruption, you need at least 4 actors and that are working together and addressing different aspects of the problem. Companies, for instance, play a critical role in setting the right tone within the company. A successful anti-corruption program needs strong leadership focused at developing the appropriate culture within the company. And here I think it's a broad range of issues. It's corruption, it's fraud, it's conflicts of interests, and that's the first way to address it. Then you need, of course, the regulations and the laws. But you need civil society to offer, for instance, additional trainings. And the way these 3 dynamics come into play, I think, is well illustrated if you consider the problem of the whistleblower. And the company, the employee that sees that there is possible misconduct and wants to report it needs to have a procedure. He also needs to be taken seriously, he needs to be assisted, and he also needs to be protected. And in some countries, because of history or cultural issues, there is a fear that if you report misconduct, then the authorities will come after your family, or there'll be a form of reprimand. And so, in short, I think you need a holistic approach. And it's only if you combine all of these elements that you'll create an environment in which people are comfortable discussing these issues and responding to them.
Ambassador.
Exactly. I will look at this aspect from a practical point of view. Imagine one of us here goes to an African country. As soon as he reaches there, there is another business culture, different from his own business culture. And depending upon the level of education, legislative framework, institutions existing, and how much application of all these are taking place, depending upon all these. People are tempted to give bribes or to take bribes. It is a behavioral issue which has to be addressed. This is why we have thought in Mauritius that let us start by educating the people. Let us start by closing the loopholes in the company law. Let us start by looking for the weaknesses, addressing them. Weaknesses everywhere, addressing them. And most importantly, there should be constant research on the pattern of corruption. Corruption is dynamic. It changes, it reacts. For one law you bring in, there will be 10 ways of going away from that.
Yeah.
So it will be always difficult to combat corruption. There will be attempts, successes, progress and successes, but it will never be possible to eradicate corruption completely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I wondered if one of you wanted to touch the question on the potential nexus between illicit flows and corruption.
No.
You don't want to touch it?
No, I do.
Oh, okay.
No.
Please.
I just didn't want to.
Just making sure.
I didn't want to overstep my
Please.
time. No, I'm well aware of the comment, and I see that the person who's asked the question has actually stayed. So he said he was going to leave, but I hope makes it worth your while. Surely, there are two different ways of. They're different. They're different in terms of the response that they create, or the need for a response, and to deal with them. But one point I think that I mentioned in my presentation is that clearly a significant amount of these illicit flows, and I don't know the percentages, result, or the money is the result of corrupt practices, however you want to define them, whether it's a head of state who's ripping off mineral income, or it is somebody who is profiting from the fact that he's the head of the procurement board. A significant proportion of that leaves the country in illicit flows. And I'm just making the point that I think we, in the business of fighting corruption, it is important to see how we can at least relate or bring on the same agenda issues that impinge on the same set of questions. And I do believe, and as a matter of fact I've seen it, that there is more attention. Illicit flows now currently are the flavor of the month. And I think it's important that we use that opportunity to translate some of that back towards where a lot of the gains or the rents were being created, and try to get policymakers to focus on those issues at the same time.
Yeah. I think both of you are touching on a real key point, which is the possibility that you're raising, that in this day when there's such a focus on security issue, particularly the impact of terrorism, that the focus has become how the illicit flows are flowing into the terrorist network, and that will become the focus of strategies and everything else what we have, when in fact there's a much larger issue here that manifests itself differently and therefore calls for a different strategy. So your point is well noted. We don't want the war on terrorism to define the response to this larger issue, because it extends beyond terrorism, and therefore how do we unpack that and find the correct strategy? So we got you, we noted that. Let me take another round of questions. I'll start with the gentleman right here.
Tony Carroll, I'm a senior associate at CSIS. I teach at Johns Hopkins, among many other things. A couple things. First of all, in the room over there, now President Buhari, 12 years ago, said in a small meeting that was chaired by your predecessor, said that the legacy of corruption will live many generations into the future of Nigeria. It's a powerful statement, which he's now having to confront hands-on. But I also would like to cite the recent death of the work of Douglas North, who passed away just recently, the Nobel laureate for economics, and one of the great, I think, lodestones in our thinking, current thinking on, and particularly in this field, is the presence of institutions. I was fortunate to be a charter member of the ABA's Foreign Corrupt Practices Task Force with Stuart Abercrombie Baker. And it was at that task force that pushed our colleagues in the European Bar to really push forward on the OECD Declaration against Corruption. What I don't see in Africa, and having worked as a lawyer and businessman in Africa for 40 years and chairman of the ABA Africa Law Committee in the 80s, is a lack of a movement to organize lawyers on a continent-wide basis to not only measure but advocate for the creation of stronger institutions and responses to fight corruption, because you ultimately are the actors in the middle in these transactions. So my perhaps suggestion or request or question is, what do you see as an emergence of an Africa-wide movement among the bar and judges to try to create some impetus and have that issue owned by Africans rather than us beating on the door against Africans as being an issue of the North? Sorry, that was a complicated question, sorry.
I think it was a very straightforward question, but we appreciate the backdrop. Thank you. We'll have the gentleman right behind you.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on his comment about Nigeria. My name is Emmanuel Nwankwo. I'm with the U.S. Customs, and one of the steering committee member of the President's Security Governance Initiative. And I'll be visiting Nigeria in January to meet the government of Buhari. And I wanted to ask questions regarding to procurement. In the news recently, we heard that the former National Security Advisor was arrested on the issue of procurement. And that's part of our discussion when we get to Nigeria in terms of how to address the issue of corruption in procurement in the military and defense sectors. So what would be your suggestion or line of opening to discussions with Buhari if you were to address that?
That's a loaded one, but we can get to it. We'll take the lady right here.
Hi, Kim Malin-Clark from AECOM International Development. I wanted to follow up on Ambassador Phokeer commented on the establishment of the equivalent of an anti-corruption commission. I don't remember exactly what the title was, but there was also a lot of other things that you've done. And a question for all of the panelists, how valuable do you think anti-corruption commissions have proven to be as standalone separate institutions? Have they proven to be more effective than prevention and prosecution mechanisms that currently exist, or strengthening of existing laws that the ambassador mentioned? Okay. I've noticed that they seemed to be the fad for a while, and now they may have fallen out of favor.
Okay. So 3 questions, and I'll start from the ambassador this time. The first one on the importance of institutions and how, particularly focused on the legal dimension of it and how you can take African legal professionals to take ownership of this issue. The second one to do with the challenges of procurement within the Nigerian defense sector. And the third question on the value of anti-corruption commissions as standalone instruments or as part of a larger network of institutions, and what the pattern there has been in Africa over the last few years. So, Mr. Ambassador, I'll start with you and then we'll swing it inwards.
Thank you. In fact, prevention is very important. When I say the three-pronged approach, the first is prevention, which incorporates education. The second one is the investigation. Once somebody is caught, you investigate. And the third one is prosecution and conviction, and where seizure of properties follow. If you attach equal importance to these three stages, and if the basis of your action is the rule of law, if you can assure all communities that there will be fair trial, there is no vengeance, there is no hatred, it's very impartial, then you will succeed. But as I said, you cannot eradicate corruption, but you can break it, you can stop it, you can refrain. Therefore, this integral approach, inclusive approach, bringing private sector, youth, trade unions, government, investors, bringing them all on board is very important. And this is how you can succeed in combating corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll address the question about the role of lawyers' associations in fighting corruption. I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's definitely a significant role here that needs to be played. First question to me is, where's the best place to do it? Is it at the continent level? Is it regional level? Or is it at local bar associations? And I think depending on where you situate yourself, maybe the programs can be tailored differently in addressing different priorities. But generally speaking, I think lawyers, and this could be part of the training programs for business leaders, have a role to play in promoting awareness and training initiatives, and because they can draft policies and procedures, and they're very close to the transactions. So I agree with you. That's something that should be emphasized, and maybe it's something for the ABA to do or initiate. Concerning the role of independent anti-corruption agencies, I can't really address that other by saying that I think it really depends on the structure and the tradition of particular governments and constitutional systems, and the extent to which, for instance, a country will use independent agencies if they have a tradition in doing that, if it's a division in a big ministry, if the country is organized federally or it's centralized. So I don't really have a clear answer on that, but it's the issue of what the appropriate institution is to fight corruption, what the most effective is maybe an item to add in the monitoring and evaluation process, where experts can come together and exchange their experiences and perspectives on that. At the OECD, for instance, you have two countries that are assigned to evaluate another country of the OECD, and their findings are then shared with the working group. So there's a dialogue that is ongoing, and I think maybe that could be one forum to consider the matter.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I don't have enough information on this, but I think it is a really good question that you ask. And I think one of the issues for me is just how independent is the Anti-Corruption Commission. There are countries where that is basically owned by the government. There isn't enough distance there for the commission to be able to do its work. And so I think those are some of the things that you would have to unpack. That's number one. And number two, is it the only institution that exists in terms of trying to fight corruption, or are other institutions in place to provide the checks and balances, to provide that distance away from the government? So I think those are issues that you would have to look at country by country in terms of the distance between the political people in power and the institutions that exist to be able to check that sort of thing. But it is a really good question, and I think that one that needs further exploration. Christian?
Yeah, I mean, just a final point on the anti-corruption commissions. I think what you're saying is correct. It has been the fad for initially, the policy recommendations that were going forward in the 1980s. Anti-corruption commissions were a major part of that. I think they were supposed to address an issue that continued to exist because there was very little commitment of the higher echelons in government to provide anti-corruption commissions with the necessary tools to be more effective than the judiciary has been or whatever. And I think so they were sent on a mission impossible, and then it got worse and worse. Nevertheless, there are some that I know in Africa who seem to be working extremely well, but they are very strongly supported from the top. They can, and they have that room and space to go after the big fish and be much more aggressive in terms of surveilling the law. Maybe I should take the question about the procurement because that hasn't happened yet. The procurement is clearly, as I indicated, I mean, and and that's the reason why you're asking the question. Obviously, procurement is the area where a lot of that corruption occurs. It is also, whether that's good or bad, it's also been the subject, as you know, of a tremendous amount of literature, and there are all sorts of recommendations that are being made from the OECD to the World Bank to the other multilateral development banks to Transparency International, with a lot of very good recommendations as to how the process of procurement can be made less corrupt. I think there's, as I said, there's a ton of good information. I think what we in the World Bank has just completed its major procurement reform, the first one in 30 plus years. The tendency seems to be towards a greater degree of automaticity. The point about using smart technology. E-procurement is being used and has shown to give some very good results in terms of bringing down that room there is for corruption to occur. So technology is definitely one where we seem to. The other one seems to be towards more disclosure, more information about what is being, not just we have taken this bid or that bid. No, how were the bids looked at? Who was the winner? Who was the loser? What are the details? And not just procurement, but also the upstream from there. I mean, how was the decision made to do that project in that particular context? Easier said than done. Major role to play for the civil society, and not always capable and up to snuff to be a good partner in this. What we have seen, and I'm talking now about the construction sector transparency initiative, where this is a big issue, is that the multi-stakeholder approach towards this, where you bring the private sector, government, and civil society together, there seems to be an understanding among them that it's really to the benefit of all, to break this process transparent and hold people to account. And this is where we have seen very significant results also from mobilizing the private sector that sees this as an opportunity to level the playing field. So the solution towards greater disclosure and a multi-stakeholder type approach seem to be providing some important benefits in addition to many of the other things that are much more regulatory and legal and what have you. I think in the case of Nigeria, there is no shortage of recommendations that have been made. And I think it's perhaps the job to help people. Did you say you were from Nigeria?
Yes.
Yes, well, you know that there are so many smart people in Nigeria who know exactly how to deal with this issue. But somehow or another, they're either not speaking up or they're not being given the opportunity to provide the guidance. But there is no shortage of possibilities, and I do think that it has evolved over time. And tackling procurement will be obviously not just in Nigeria, maybe a major step in the direction of solving some of the more intricate corruption problems.
Thank you. And I think on that, and I'll be happy to talk to you. You're downstairs, aren't you? Yes, so I'm right here at the Wilson Center. I spent 14 years working at the Department of Defense, and one of the programs we run was managing security resources in Africa, of which Nigeria actually hosted one of those programs. So I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit more about some of the best practices and some of the things that can be done to tackle resource expenditure in the defense sector. I think that's number one. Having said that, I must say that most of us are cheering President Buhari on. We all know, and I think here we have to be very direct, Nigeria is a country that's rich in people, mineral, and other resources. Should be no reason why Nigeria is in the state that it's in today. We like that he has focused on this, but it's going to be a challenge because in many ways, corruption in Nigeria has become systemic. And so just breaking that and pulling it out of the fabric of society is going to be a real challenge. And President Buhari deserves all the support that he needs to get Nigeria back on track so it can realize, one, its leadership role on the continent, but two, do what it needs to do for its people. So I'm happy to talk to you about that. I don't want to monopolize this. But having said this, let me just say this. I think our speakers have done a really wonderful job today in sort of shining the spotlight on this issue of corruption. And I think a number of messages emerge for me. One, Africa is a huge continent, 54 different countries, and these countries, corruption impacts these countries differently. So we shouldn't be so quick to talk about corruption in Africa, that it's a much more useful, I think, exercise to interrogate corruption on a country-by-country basis because it does manifest itself differently in different African countries. If you just look at all the negatives that impact Africa in terms of corruption, it'll be very difficult to make a case for any U.S. business or any business to go and engage with Africa. So I think one of the messages that we got out of today's thing is like, take the time to really figure out which country you're interested in and then do your due diligence to figure out how corruption manifests itself. I think that was one key message that came out here today. I think a second message for me that came out of the discussion is that political will and political leadership matters. And I think the ambassador made this very, very clearly. And you see it across the countries that rank at the top of Transparency International, the Mo Ibrahim Index, all the countries that I mentioned earlier on, the Mauritius, the Botswanas, those are the same countries where you see leadership really taking ownership of this issue and trying to grapple with it across various realms. So that was a key point that came out. But then we also heard across all three speakers the importance of establishing the policy and the legal framework. And obviously, if you're a U.S. company that's wanting to go into Africa, you need to do your, into any African countries, you need to do your homework. What does the policy and legal framework look like? And the countries that have succeeded, again, are those countries that have a strong, vibrant, and per the ambassador's last point, and I thought that was a really important point, that it's not important to have a policy and a legal framework, but you need one that is responsive to how corruption changes and tries to find the path of least resistance as more institutions and mechanisms are put into place. That you can't just say, we've done what we need to do, we stop. But you have to see how it's conforming and changing, and you need to adapt your mechanisms accordingly. I think the other issue that we talked about here today, and I think this is a key one, sometimes we focus on the demand side of corruption. and we don't do enough to look at the supply side. One of the messages that I got across all three speakers is the importance of ensuring that you're looking at corruption at both the supply and the demand side. So it's not just those people who are asking for bribes, but it's also those people who are giving. In order to be effective in this fight, you need to address both the supply and demand side. There was a point that was made earlier on that I think we may have missed somehow, and I can't stress enough the importance of this. This cannot be an internationally driven fight. There has to be African ownership. And we heard from different contributors, both the panel, but also all of you there. What are we teaching in terms of the curriculum? Education can be a big part of addressing this issue. That was number one. Number two, how is the legal profession in Africa taking ownership of this issue? How is civil society playing in this fight? All of those are factors that we need to stress in terms of allowing Africans to take ownership of this thing. That's the only way this fight is going to succeed. And I thought we heard some really strong recommendations across the board. Another issue that came up, and the ambassador, but all of our speakers here talked about it as well. We talked about the normative framework that exists at the international level, the regional level, and at the national level. That's important, and it needs to be in place. However, one of the challenges that I see, not all, but in a majority of African countries, is that there has not been a domestication of these instruments. And I thought one of the points the ambassador made was really critical to me was he talked about Mauritius having signed and ratified. The ratification for me is the important thing, because the ratification for me is when you really begin the implementation. So when I look at African countries and how many countries have signed up to the African Union's Corruption Act, only about half African countries have signed. Even fewer have ratified. That tells me about the lack of commitment to this issue for those African countries that have not signed on. I also think that African countries can do more, and I think this is a discussion that we ought to have at some point. What do I mean by doing more? And I shouldn't be saying this because I don't have the evidence to back it up, but here's how I sometimes look at this issue. There are those African countries who are cognizant of the fact that they need to do more to attract that international investment, that it won't just come. There are some who I feel are quite happy to sit back and say, we have the Chinese fighting for us and, they will come in and engage no matter what. So we don't have to do anything with this. So investment will always come. For me, that's a rather short-sighted way of looking at this issue, especially when you look at the context in which, for example, right now, the Chinese are going through their own issues at home. Nobody really knows how that's going to impact their engagement on the African continent. And I say this to say that there should be an active process and active engagement for trying to attract more investment on African terms, granted, but you do that by creating that environment that allows people to come and invest. So I think those are some of the key issues that I heard. Let me see. Okay, I'll leave that one alone. I will leave that one alone. All right. So I think I will now just give each of our speakers, before I invite Mr. Brown to come and close us off, give each of our speakers just 1 minute. If there was one recommendation that you would make to a US company trying to do business in Africa, what would that recommendation be as far as this corruption is concerned? So in 1 minute, one recommendation for a US company trying to do business in Africa. Mr. Ambassador.
Very simple answer. Try to know your partner. It takes two to tango. So try to know the business culture in the country there. Try to know the culture, the background. Do your due diligence. And bear in mind that in some parts of the world, it takes some time before you reach your goal. it could take some time. And be patient, but the return would be great. IMF says that there will be big investment in Africa for the coming years. So that is a part for that businessman you're referring to me. Thank you.
Thank you, and spoken like a true diplomat. I'm not a diplomat, so I'm going to go very directly to the point that you just made about patience. I think that's a very diplomatic way of talking about the pace that can sometimes characterize just getting through the bureaucracy and doing what you need to get done. And again, I get the point. It's a different pace out there, but it's also another area where I think some African countries need to make some improvements.
Thank you very much. I would just say preparing a highly competitive investment and taking anti-corruption compliance seriously is not mutually exclusive. And there are just a couple things you need to do. You need to do a risk assessment. You need to put in place good policies and procedures. You need to conduct thorough due diligence, just to echo what Mr. Ambassador just mentioned, and make sure you know who you're doing the business with. And then once you're putting your investment in place and during your life of the investment, you just have to monitor this internal system and conduct training and awareness initiatives so that not only your team back home that has prepared the investment and launched it, but also your team on the ground that will be responsible for the life of your investment, all are abiding by the same principles and have the same vision about how to conduct business in that particular country.
Thank you. Mr. Transparency International, you have the last word.
Oh, well, that's very kind. I think twofold. I mean, also echoing somewhat what my two colleagues have said. I mean, and what you said, which is do your homework. Do understand, get your understanding of the continent. I mean, I said, before we started the presentation, I said I'm torn, because on the one hand side, I'd like to see corruption attacked, and the picture in Africa is not pretty. At the same time, I'm a development economist. For 30 years I have, and nearly 15 years, 12 to 15 years of that I have spent in and around Africa, working on African countries, dealing with development issues. And I think we should be worried in painting a picture that is only dark. There is lots. There are islands of opportunity and islands of integrity, as we say within Transparency International, and we need to continue to work with those to tip the balance. So the only way in which an international investor and a US investor can make that assessment is to make his or her boots dirty and go out there and understand the lay of the land and see where the real risks lie. And obviously if the risk is too great, then that's not your time and it's not your investment. The other one is be part of the solution. It's somewhat related to the first one, but it is see yourself as not as a marginal player who sort of takes the corruption risk and tries to minimize this and do business. No, be part of a coalition of people who really want to deal with corruption that goes much beyond that particular project that you have. Do it nationally in terms of supporting the good guys, so to say, the other people in country that want to see the changes, and also internationally. I am appalled that the private sector has been so reluctant in getting involved in issues related, say, to the G20 and their anti-corruption agenda. We have concerns about the private sector in this whole movement towards open government, in which they are not available. And they don't see that as something that is really affecting them. So it is take a broader view, not just in terms of the country, but also a broader view about dealing with issues of transparency and accountability. As I said, be part of the solution, and it will repay itself in many ways.
It's a powerful note on which to end this, and there are three resources that I go to when I look at some of these issues on the African continent. I think for any company, those three resources that I would look at, one is the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business, in Africa. I think it gives you a sense of, what's going on, the regulatory frameworks and the changes that African countries are doing. A second one for me is Transparency International's index. That comes out every year. And then the third and final one for me is the Mo Ibrahim Index on African Governance, which rates countries across a broad range of elements to look at how well governments are responding and providing for their people and addressing these issues of good governance, accountability, and all of that. And so there's a good starting ground. There's some information about out there, but it will not prevent you from having to go on the ground and do your own work, but there's stuff that you can do from this end. And so with that, let me now invite Mr. Brown, who is a cabinet member at the Woodrow Wilson Center and chairman and CEO and founder of Brown Capital Management, to offer closing remarks. Mr. Brown?
Thank you. Thank you, Mandy. We still have people left. This has been a great day, a great panel, and want to thank each of you for your brilliant remarks. Really appreciate it. How many of you came to the inaugural forum back in September?
Good, go on there.
Okay, so let me just mention how Brown Capital got started on this. My remarks will be 3 minutes. Sylvia, my wife, sitting in the front row, and I became members about 4 years ago of the National Cabinet here at the Wilson Center. The National Cabinet, after the first year, started to meet with the Board of Trustees, who are presidential appointees. And we were privy to all of the financials, and I noted this world-class, top-ranked think tank, not only in the United States, but in the world, were doing amazing work in various places, but very little resources were being allocated to Africa. Along comes a superstar. She mentioned 14 years. When Monday got here, Rhodes Scholar, absolutely brilliant, committed, I said to Jane Harmon, I said, look, what can we, Brown Capital, do to raise the profile of some great opportunities in Africa? Came up with the idea of the forum. So we've had 2. This is the second one this year. We'll do at least 3 for the next 4 years. So keep your eyes open. Would love to have you and others come back. It's an educational process for us and hopefully for you. We are money managers. We invest billions of dollars of other people's money and a little of our own globally. One of our international team members is sitting here in the front row. And over the past year or so, I said, do we invest any money in companies in Africa? And they said, yeah, in South Africa. I said, no, I meant in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And when I really dug into it and started talking with these brilliant investors that invest all over the world, it came to rule of law, size of market. I said, that's not a good one. I said, we invest in smaller companies, so size of market we can kind of deal with. Rule of law, corruption. So I said to Monday, early on in the forum, I would like to have a discussion of one of the major barriers. We don't pay to play. And, that's why we have kind of distanced ourselves. So hopefully, I've learned the ranking. There are several in good shape. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Did I hear you say big investments? Thank you very much.
Mauritius.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Brown. Again, I cannot thank Brown Capital enough for really elevating the place and the role of Africa within the Woodrow Wilson Center's portfolio and engagement, and I think by doing so also helping to elevate U.S.-Africa engagement on these key issues. So thank you very much, and as Mr. Brown said, our next Brown Capital Africa Forum event is in January, and in February 2016. We hope to see many of you there, and one of the issues we're going to be looking at that event is on the link between trade and investment and basically realizing the new Sustainable Development Goals. And so we hope that you'll be able to join us for that event. But for now, please join me in thanking our three speakers. And I would now like to invite all of you to join us for a short reception in the atrium where we can continue to mix and mingle. But I would like to invite the Brown Capital Management team to join us on the podium with the speakers for a quick photo.